Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you all and thank you for joining us for the second in our virtual SALT conference series with DEEP wildlife biologist Jane Seymour and her presentation on managing critical habitats at the Niering Natural Area Preserve in Waterford, Connecticut. My name is Maggie Redfern, and I am the Associate Director of the Connecticut College Arboretum. I hope you were able to join us for our first presentation last Wednesday, the role of riparian buffers in watersheds and your local landscapes with Juliana Barrett. If not, please note that that recording is available through Zoom until just next Wednesday. I would like to thank the Connecticut Mountain Laurel chapter of Wild Ones for their support of this program and encourage you all to join their organization, to receive emails, and check out their Facebook page for information about their free monthly programs that include lectures, workshops, and field trips, many of which are held here at the Connecticut College Arboretum. Last week, I spoke a little about the origins of SALT, the Smaller American Lawn Today movement, and Connecticut College professor William Niering, who conceived of SALT as an initiative to garden using environmentally sound practices that are in harmony with nature. Today, we will learn about the natural area preserved named in honor of William Niering in the year 2000. The 80-acre site combines several of his favorite habitat types, most notably tidal wetlands and grasslands. He visited Goshen Cove, which is the wetland within the Natural Area Preserve, soon after arriving at Connecticut College in 1952, and in the 1990s spent many hours cataloging the plants, describing the natural communities, and providing DEP with an approach to maintaining coastal grasslands. I think that today's talk will provide inspiration to all of us for how we maintain our landscapes. I'll just, it looks like everyone's turned off their video and on mute. Just encourage you all to stay that way throughout the presentation. If you have questions you think of during the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat feature. And following the presentation, we'll have time for questions and answers, and you're welcome to turn on video and talk at that time. We have a small enough group that I think it would be enjoyable for us to be able to maybe see each other and have a little bit of a conversation about what we learned today. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Jane Seymour is a wildlife biologist for the Connecticut DEP and steward of the Belding Wildlife Management Area in Vernon, Connecticut. She oversees habitat projects at several wildlife management areas and natural area preserves in eastern Connecticut. Habitat projects involve controlling non-native invasive plants, promoting native plants, and creating young forest habitat for species of greatest conservation need. She also creates educational materials related to wildlife conservation, conducts wildlife programs, and provides technical assistance for wildlife habitat management. It's my pleasure to now introduce Jane Seymour.
Thank you, Maggie. Okay, is that working now for everybody?
That looks great.
All right, great. All right, well, thanks again, Maggie. So I'm talking about the William A. Niering Natural Area Preserve in Waterford, Connecticut. So some of you may have visited this area. It's the eastern or the western side of Harkness Memorial State Park. So we take a closer look of just the Natural Area Preserve. It encompasses the former Enders property. So this area that's outlined in orange, that had belonged to Ostersendrum and the state acquired it and included that in the Natural Area Preserve along with the eastern or the western portion of the Harkness State Park. Now, because of Dr. Niering's work it was seen how important this piece of land was. He had done some research here, and he had done some plant surveys, and he divided his surveys up into different parts of the preserve. So notably, this grassland area, this is dominated by little bluestem. So little bluestem is an important native grass. And this section of the natural area preserve is a little higher in very well-drained soils. So the soil is pretty dry, and that's the type of situation that the little bluestem grass likes. He also looked at plants in this site just north of the little bluestem area. So this is a very low meadow, and it tends to get flooded from time to time. So it has a different set of plants in here. So rushes and sedges and some wetland plants. And he also looked at this, what he calls the mixed forb grassland. So this area sits a little lower than the bluestem grassland. The soils are a little richer, and so there's more wildflowers mixed in with this area than there are in the little bluestem area. And as Maggie pointed out, he was particularly interested in some of the salt marsh vegetation. So this area right here is an intertidal marsh with a lot of spartina, the smooth cordgrass and salt marsh cordgrass, as well as some other marsh plants. And he also looked at the dune vegetation. So he found a very rare dune plant here, as well as some other dune plants like beach plum and bayberry. Now, because of his work, it was known how important this area was. So because of the things that he found here, and because of his advocacy, it was determined that this site should be declared a natural area preserve. So in 1999, it was officially designated a natural area preserve, originally called the Goshen Cove Natural Area Preserve. But in 2000, it was renamed in his honor, the Dr. William A. Niering Natural Area Preserve. Now, at about that time, there was also some critical habitat mapping going on by our agency. So areas that were really critical for habitat for certain plants and wildlife species. And you can see most of the Niering Natural Area Preserve has some type of critical habitat within it. So coastal grassland is one of the critical habitat types, as well as the intertidal marsh or the salt marsh, and also the beach shore. So these critical habitats, these are our highest conservation priority habitats, and they're in rather short supply. So there's not a lot of them left. So let's take a look first at the critical coastal grassland habitat. So this type of habitat is, as I said, in short supply, but really important. And in the Connecticut Coastal and Estuary Land Conservation Program Plan, it was identified as an outstanding habitat representative of the Long Island system. So there used to be a lot more grassland habitat. In fact, it's estimated now that Connecticut has less grassland habitat than what was here when the settlers first arrived. And we know that over in Long Island, it was about a 50 square mile grassland habitat. These habitats are very easy to develop. And so those were some of the first areas that were lost to development. So not a lot of them left. So it's really important that we protect the remaining grassland habitats, especially these coastal grassland habitats. Now, Dr. Niering had talked about the little bluestem grassland. So the little bluestem grass, it's one of our bunch grasses. And a large field of the little bluestem grass is a type of plant that some of our grassland ground nesting birds would use. So they actually make their nests at the base of these clump grasses like little bluestem grass. And then the seeds would provide food for some of the overwintering birds in the late fall and in the winter. So great structural element for the habitat, but also really important for some of our butterflies. So they don't get nectar from these plants. So the adult butterflies are not feeding at little bluestem, but some of our butterflies lay their eggs on grasses such as little bluestem. And these butterflies here, the common wood nymph and some of our grass skippers, particularly like the little bluestem grass. And these 4 butterflies at the bottom, these grass skippers, they really prefer the little blue stem and maybe one or two other species of grass. So this little blue stem grass is really important. Now, you typically find it growing on drier areas. Now, it's not that it doesn't like moister soil or richer soil, but it can't compete with other plants when it's growing in that richer soil. And that's why you tend to find little blue stem growing where the soil is drier. Another grass that some of these butterflies like is the purple top. So another grass, another native grass that some of our butterflies with their caterpillars will feed on. So some of these caterpillars actually prefer the purple top grass. And if you're looking for an ornamental grass for your yard, this is a nice one. I love the purple top. When you have a clump of it, it has that nice sort of purplish haze when it goes to flower and then to seed. But it's not just the butterflies. There are some moths whose caterpillars also depend on grasses. So these are some of the listed species of moths that were found at Niering. So the pink streak moth, its caterpillars feed on switchgrass. The wainscot moth feeds on beach grass, and the apomea moth feeds on sedges and some other grasses, but they like those coastal plain habitats. A few other listed moths, so these were special concern or threatened species of moths. They like that coastal habitat, but they're feeding on other types of plants, not grasses. So we found the goldenrod stem borer, and this caterpillar feeds on seaside goldenrod. So we have quite a bit of seaside goldenrod at Niering. That's the one with the really fleshy leaves that helps it cope with the salt air. The coastal cutworm moth, its caterpillars will feed on shadbush, also known as serviceberry, which we find down in these coastal sites, and the short-line chocolate moth. Its caterpillar feeds on beach plum, and that's a plant that tends to grow on the dune. So the dune at Niering has some of this beach plum. So these species were all found at the Niering Natural Area Preserve. And some of the birds that are there, some of the birds that can survive on smaller patches of grassland would include the bluebird. So they feed their young caterpillars and moths and other insects. So as it turns out, caterpillars are really important for birds when they're raising their young. And most caterpillars need native plants. So we grow native plants, we'll have the caterpillars that will feed the birds. Birds that need bigger areas of grassland include things like bobolink and meadowlark. So they need about 10 or 20 acres minimum to nest in a grassland area. Now they might use a smaller field if it's adjacent to other fields. So they'd be drawn in on that coarse scale landscape to a large grassland area. The best sites are unbroken, at least 20 acres, but they might nest in the smaller areas if they're adjacent to other grassland areas. Now, Dr. Niering had seen a meadowlark when he was doing his vegetation surveys at Niering. So we're hoping if we maintain all of these grasslands at Niering and Harkness adjacent to it, maybe we can bring some of these other grassland birds back. But one of the grassland birds that we do have at Niering is the purple martin. So this bird feeds exclusively on the wing. So it feeds as it's flying, it's catching flying insects, and it'll feed over the grassland and over the water as well. But this bird nests in cavities, but in groups of cavities. So you might have seen purple martin houses where you have a structure that has quite a few individual openings where each pair will raise its young in. And so we've had purple martins nesting at Niering, as well as tree swallows and some of the other nest box and the bluebird. So as you may know, these are all cavity nesting birds. If you put up a nest box at your house, of course, you want to watch out for this guy. This is the non-native invasive house sparrow. So if you have a bluebird box, you're going to need to be taking the house sparrow nest out. In fact, I had one at my house and I was taking a house sparrow nest out every single day until they finally gave up, but it took quite a while. They're very persistent. Red-winged blackbird is another one of our ground nesting birds. So you might think of red-winged blackbirds as a marsh bird, and they do make their nests in marshes. They'll weave their nest between the reeds and the marshes, but they also nest on the ground in grasslands. And they particularly like that field that's just to the east of the entrance road at Harkness. Notice that field in the late summer, it's full of goldenrod and Joe Pye weed. So whereas bobolink and meadowlark prefer grasslands that are dominated by actual grasses, red-winged blackbirds can nest in fields that are a little smaller and have a bigger component of wildflowers. So we're looking now at the area that's mostly the little blue stem area. So this peninsula, sort of higher up than the surrounding areas, well-drained soil, but this was also used for agriculture. This was mowed regularly for hay, and that's how it stayed in that grassland state. This management was good for the little blue stem. However, mowing hay is not necessarily good for some of our grass and ground nesting birds. So while it provides that type of habitat, if someone is growing hay for food, then it's mowed at the same time that the birds are trying to nest. So you might think, well, if it was a grassland because it was getting mowed, how natural is that? And what happened was when it stopped being mowed, it started turning into a shrubland. Now, it was actually a great shrubland because it had some native shrubs in there, sassafras, winged sumac, bayberry, highbush blueberry. But remember, this was an exceptional example of coastal grassland habitat. Now, even though this was naturally succeeding, we want to maintain that grassland habitat. But how is it that we would have had so much grassland habitat before the settlers arrived if it wants to succeed into this woody vegetation? Well, our habitats sort of shift across the landscape and they go through these cycles. So this is the process of succession. So at the beginning stage of succession, you might have exposed ground, and that might go all the way back to a glacier retreating, but also happen after fire or other natural disturbance, a flood or tornado. And the grasses start to grow, and that's when you have your grassland habitat. Now, in Connecticut, fire was a frequent occurrence on the landscape. So in those true grassland areas where the soil was very dry, it was more susceptible to fire. Plus, we know that Native Americans also used fire frequently on the landscape. But eventually, the shrubs start to pop up, tree seedlings. Eventually, it reverts to the shrublands. That's sort of what it looked like at Niering. The tree seedlings continued to grow into young forest and then a mature forest. And then a disturbance such as a fire could push that all the way back to the beginning stage of succession again. So how do we manage a grassland? If we want to maintain this outstanding example of coastal grassland at Niering, how do we do it? Do we set it on fire? Well, sure. And that's what we did. We've actually been using prescribed fire to maintain some of the grassland habitat. But we do need to do this in conjunction with mowing as well. So we use both fire periodically. We don't want to use it every year. Every few years, interspersed with a mowing regime to keep it that nice native grassland habitat. So these natural disturbances are why we would have had these early stages of that process of succession. That's why we have native grass species and native grassland dependent species in Connecticut. And this map just shows the different fields that we've used prescribed fire on, and especially you see field number 1, that's the little blue stem grassland. So that does particularly well with fire. Now, some of the wildflowers that are in that mixed forb grassland habitat include Joe Pye weed. So Joe Pye weed is one of our native wildflower plants that the butterflies particularly love. So if you grow Joe Pye weed in your yard, you will have butterflies. And Joe Pye weed is also one of the plants that just might come in on its own. So it's a popular landscaping plant. There are sources to purchase these. But in my yard, I have some moist soil, and I just stopped mowing and this just took off on its own. And the butterflies love it. Goldenrod is another one that comes in on its own. Dr. Niering found several species of goldenrod growing in Connecticut. So in Connecticut, we have over 20 different species of goldenrod, and they're all native to Connecticut. And they're really important plants for our native bees. We have about 300 different species of native bees in Connecticut, and they love the goldenrod, as do beetles, butterflies, moths, caterpillars of some species. And as it turns out, goldenrod is a really important plant for monarch butterflies when they're migrating south to Mexico. And so the Niering Preserve and Harkness State Park is actually a staging area. If you go there in the fall, you're likely to see quite a few monarch butterflies passing through and stopping at the goldenrod to fuel up. Now, goldenrod gets a bad rap. Some people are still accusing it of causing hay fever, but goldenrod is an insect pollinated plant. The pollen does not get airborne, but it's conspicuous. And so when people get hay fever, they see goldenrod, but they don't see the ragweed, the one that's actually causing the hay fever, because ragweed is inconspicuous. So goldenrod gets the blame, but goldenrod does not cause hay fever. So I once attended a talk on invasive and native plants. And one of the speakers said, if you can only grow 2 plants in your yard, make it goldenrod and asters. So these are particularly important plants, especially for the monarch butterflies, because as they make their way to Mexico, they have to keep stopping and finding fuel all the way back to Mexico. I mentioned that we're trying to maintain this as grassland habitat, but along the edge, we're encouraging some of the plants, some of the woody plants, like the marsh elder and the groundsel tree, right along the edge, bayberry and some beach plum. So these are some good native shrubs and small trees that we'll be maintaining along the edge of the system. But there is also rugosa rose, also known as beach rose. Now, inland, this doesn't become too much of a problem, but along the coast, it is invasive. It does tend to take over. So at the Natural Area Preserve, this is one of the species that we will be controlling because of its aggressive properties where it outcompetes our native plants. Okay, let's take a look at one of the other critical habitats. We'll look at the beach shore habitat down here. And along the beach shore at Niering, we have some state and federally listed bird species. So the piping plover is a federally threatened species. Its populations have gotten so small. And the least tern is a state endangered species. So these birds lay their eggs right on the ground. Their eggs blend in with the ground. And then the piping plover, when the chicks hatch, in just a few hours, they're up and running around and they're looking for food themselves. The least terns, the parents will take care of the chicks for a little while before they get up and start fending for themselves. But both of these birds are in trouble. And here's why. They depend on this habitat, this very fine ribbon of habitat between the ocean and the land. So this very fine ribbon of habitat. So not a lot of habitat to begin with, but historically enough to maintain healthy populations. But now in the summer, this is where everybody else likes to go too. So a lot of their habitat has been taken away. They don't have this habitat available to them to nest anymore. So that's why we protect certain areas to give these birds a chance to raise some young. But even when there are some protected beach areas set aside specifically for these birds, they still encounter other problems, such as dogs. It's been found that dogs are deadly to these birds. So one of the things they might do, the obvious one, is they can chase and actually kill the chicks or the adult birds. They can trample them, they can trample the nest. But the other thing, which might not be so obvious, is when they scare the adult birds away, because the adults are very threatened by dogs and they're easily flushed off the nest. And when they're scared off the nest, that leaves the chicks vulnerable. They might be vulnerable to predators, but they're also exposed to the elements. They could die of starvation if the parents don't come back in time, or succumb to the elements simply from being exposed. And so that's why, if you've been to Harkness, you've seen the no dog sign during the bird nesting seasons. Is the only way we're going to allow these birds to raise their young to replace themselves, so that we'll still have these populations of birds. But if you go to Harkness, down past the viewing platform, you can take a look down at that beach shore habitat, and maybe you'll see the little birds running around, catching their food. So this is what the piping plover chicks look like. They're precocial, so as soon as the eggs hatch, they're working to get up on their feet, and then they take off, start looking for food. They look like little puffballs with legs. So we're hoping that with the protective measures at Niering, we'll be able to fledge some of these chicks. And the other critical habitat at Niering is the salt marsh, or the intertidal marsh. So Dr. Niering found an abundance of Spartina, smooth cordgrass, and salt marsh hay at the intertidal marsh here at Niering. Now, this bird here is the salt marsh sparrow, and we don't have salt marsh sparrows at Niering in the salt marsh there. They do need pretty big areas of salt marsh. But I mentioned this bird because you might have heard in the news last year about how these birds are disappearing. So in the news, they said that the salt marsh sparrow may become extinct in Connecticut. And actually, this bird is on its way to becoming completely extinct. And it's because as the sea level rises, their nests are getting flooded. So the water is higher, and we have more frequent intense storms, and these nests ended up getting flooded. So as the storms come in, the eggs or even the chicks will get washed out to sea. So the only way that we can save these birds is by taking drastic measures now. So this isn't happening at Niering, but at some other salt marshes, we're actually dredging up the sediment and spraying it onto the salt marsh to build it up, to give these birds a chance to raise their young before the nests get flooded. But at Niering, we have had documents of this species. This is the American bittern. This is an endangered species in Connecticut, and they need that salt marsh habitat. They blend in with the salt marsh vegetation. But we continue to see egrets, both snowy egrets and great egrets. These are both species of special concern. They're not nesting in the salt marsh, but the salt marsh is very important for them for feeding areas. So salt marshes are important foraging habitats for these birds and other salt marsh birds, and as well as fish. It's a nursery habitat for some of the ocean fish and for a lot of the invertebrates as well. And if you've been to Harkness, you may have seen these birds. So this is the osprey platform. So if you drive down the entrance road and look out over the cove, you might see one of these birds in their nesting platforms. So these birds were hit really hard by DDT, but they made a pretty good recovery after DDT was banned. Now, originally they would have been making their nests in big dead trees. Now we need to put up these nest platforms. And as soon as one of these platforms goes up in the appropriate habitat, you probably see these birds bringing in sticks and building these big nests. So they've made a pretty good recovery. In fact, they're not even on Connecticut's list of threatened species anymore, but they still face some problems. And one of them is discarded fishing line. So when these birds accidentally pick up the fishing line, might be tangled in a stick that they're bringing to the nest, not just osprey, but other animals have been found to get caught up, and it can be deadly when they get caught up in the fishing line. But you might have seen some of these fishing line receptacles. So if you find some discarded fishing line, you can toss it in one of these recycling receptacles to keep it away from osprey and other birds. Just an interesting note, ospreys understand aerodynamics. So the fish are hydrodynamically shaped so that they can cut easily through the water. Well, when an osprey catches a fish and flies off with it, it positions it head first, so it's easier to fly through the air. And this is another species that's been found at the Niering Natural Area Preserve. This is a willet, and it had been listed as a species of special concern in Connecticut because its populations had plummeted, but it has made a pretty good recovery and now has been delisted from Connecticut's list of threatened and endangered species. But you might see this or hear this bird because they do tend to make a lot of noise when they're flying around, but we've seen these at Niering as well, just along the edge of the salt marsh there. And so these critical habitats, they're, as I said, our highest conservation priorities as far as habitats go. And this is why we're protecting these habitats. One of the things that we need to do in order to protect these habitats and the species that depend on them is to manage some of the invasive species. So you may all be familiar with the non-native invasive Phragmites. So this grows at Niering and adjacent at Harkness Memorial State Park. So we've been tackling this plant for quite a few years, between spraying and mowing this plant to try to encourage some of that native salt marsh vegetation like that smooth cordgrass and the salt marsh hay that Dr. Niering had discovered there. This is another one of our invasive species, and I haven't seen it at Niering, but I have found it in the grasslands right next door within Harkness State Park. This is miscanthus grass. It goes by a few names: miscanthus, silvergrass, Chinese silvergrass, zebra grass. There's a few different varieties. It's become a really popular ornamental grass. And people, as they're growing it in their yards, probably aren't aware of its invasive properties because it's in a manicured area. But what they don't see is those seeds floating away, landing in natural grasslands and starting to take over the grasslands. So we've had to manage it at the Harkness grasslands. But if you're looking for an ornamental grass, perhaps the switchgrass. This is the grass that listed moth depends on for its caterpillars to feed on. So it's a nice native ornamental grass. These are the flower heads, so they're pretty cool looking. So that the listed moth and some of our grass skippers will use the switchgrass as a host plant. The multiflora rose, so I mentioned the rugosa rose before, but the multiflora rose is another nasty invasive plant that takes over grasslands. So this is another one that we're managing. And bittersweet, I'm sure everyone knows about bittersweet, and you probably know why it's so important to have the native plants as opposed to these invasive non-native plants, because as you can see, nobody's feeding on these leaves. It's the native plants that our moth and butterfly caterpillars have to have in order to have something to eat, in order for these species to survive. And it's the caterpillars and other insects, so it's so important for our birds for raising their young. Autumn olive is another one that we need to control at Niering and Harkness, and not quite as conspicuous as some of these other woody invasive plants is the yellow flag iris. So this is growing at Niering in the salt marsh area. So this yellow flag iris will take over salt marshes and other wetlands. It's a beautiful flower, but very aggressive, invasive tendencies. And of course, burning bush has been found in the along the edges at Niering and Harkness. And this is our latest, nastiest invasive plant. This is mugwort. We found small patches at Niering, and we took care of this right away between using targeted herbicide on this both at Niering and adjacent in Harkness, this has really become a problem, and it really has become a problem across the whole state. This plant has been here for probably over 100 years, but just in the past decade or so, it has really gotten out of control. In fact, at one of the large grasslands at Harkness, it pretty much completely took over, and we've been spending the past few years trying to get this plant under control. We've made progress, but this is going to be something that we're going to have to tackle year after year. So the mugwort, you probably see it all along the roadsides. It's easy to see when it's flowering because it has those stalks with all the little tiny, very light colored flowers. It's a wind pollinated plant, lots of seeds. So not all of the seeds are viable, but it produces so many seeds. Just a few seeds is all it takes. And it spreads so aggressively. In just a couple of years, it will completely take over a field. One of the ways to tell the mugwort is the underside of the leaf is sort of a whitish color, and it's rather aromatic. But once you learn to identify this plant, you're going to see it all over the place. So some of these plants get here inadvertently. Mugwort spreads quite a bit on its own. Sometimes they're intentionally put here. Now, when these trees were put here, it might not have been known at the time how invasive these trees were. But this is the Norway maple. You can tell Norway maple from sugar maple by the leaves. The leaves of Norway maple are a little bit rounder. And when you pull a leaf off, the end of the leaf stem will exude a white milky sap, as opposed to sugar maple, it will exude a clear sap. So Norway maple, and again, people tend to plant this in their yards. It's a very popular landscaping plant. And of course, it goes into manicured areas, so you don't realize how invasive it is. But those seeds end up over in the forest, and they start taking over the forest. These were actually planted along the entrance road to Harkness. Norway maple and another invasive, the sycamore maple. So this is part of the Natural Area Preserve. This probably isn't a good place to be putting non-native invasive plants. But there are alternatives to these species, such as the shadbush or serviceberry. So this was the plant that was a host plant for that listed moth species. It's also a beautiful tree, doesn't get really big. And it's tolerant of a little bit of salt. So this is one of those species that does well in coastal areas. Silver maple, tulip tree are other good options here. The birds love the berries. Another name for this is Juneberry, because these berries will actually ripen in June. And this is the listed moth that lays its eggs on serviceberry. So maintaining these grassland areas and the coastal tidal and beach shore areas, part of what William Niering had in mind. One of the things he advocated for when he did his research here and advocated for the protection of this area. So at this point, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Hi, Jane, thank you so much. We have a few questions in the chat. One is, do you know what species of Amelanchier or shadbush, serviceberry, juneberry is present at the Niering Nature Preserve? In Niering's inventory or his report from 1995, he just says shadbush, but we're curious to know the specific species if you know that.
That's a good question, and I'm trying to remember. Yeah, I don't think I'll hazard a guess.
Maybe we could follow up with folks afterwards if you're able to look at that. I'll send an email to everyone after the presentation.
Yeah, send me an email to remind me to look that up.
Okay, that sounds great. Another question, how do you eradicate yellow flag iris?
So that's a tricky one because it's a wetland, it typically grows in these marshy areas. So some of our non-targeted herbicides will work, but you just have to be careful because if it's growing in a wetland area, you want to make sure that you use an herbicide that's registered for a wetland application. Other than that, depends on your patch. Sometimes you might have a smaller patch where you can rip those out. But as any invasive, if you resort to pulling it out, you have to make sure that you get all of the root material because any part that's left will tend to resprout.
And that applies for mugwort as well. Someone's asked what herbicide you're using against mugwort, and I presume the herbicides that you're able to use with DEP are different than what a homeowner might be able to use, just with different regulations and availability for herbicides.
So actually for the mugwort, we've been using Milestone. So we just started using that last year, I think. So we had been using triclopyr, which is something that you can purchase. It's the ingredient in Brush Be Gone. And it looked like it was killing the plant, but it really only killed the above ground part of the plant. They just kept resprouting. Now we use the Milestone. And you can purchase Milestone online. It's supposed to be, it's a non-restricted, and it's supposed to be fairly safe. Although if you use it on hay, then you're not allowed to sell the hay for 18 months, I think. But if you're using it for habitat management, or in your yards, if you're not using it on food, then it's supposed to be a safe herbicide, and it has been very effective. So what they recommend is that you spray the mugwort early in the season, like late May or early June, when the plant is between 8 and 10 inches tall, and then use the Milestone. And we have found that it kills the plant all the way down to the root. And we tried with the triclopyr year after year, and it just kept coming back. We actually have now grasses and other native plants coming in where it had been so dense with mugwort. But we have to keep going back, and you have to hit every plant. So one of the problems is mugwort gets really big. So those stalks will, if you try to hit it late in the season, there's just so much leaf surface, overlapping leaf surface, it's hard to get at the entire plant. So if you have an area that has already gone to seed, you might end up needing to mow that down so that when it grows in the spring, you can hit it when it's at 8 to 10 inches, and you'll actually be able to get at the plant. The problem with mowing it down is that you can contaminate the wheels of whatever equipment you're using with the seeds or the fragments of this plant. And that's one of the ways that this gets spread around is on the wheels of mowing equipment. I think that's how we got it at one of our other areas when we scraped it to create some exposed habitat for tiger beetles. And then we ended up with mugwort. And it was probably transported on the heavy equipment.
Thank you. Definitely a challenge to remove mugwort, and the earlier we can do it in the season, or the earlier we can do it when we discover it at a property to remove it, the easier for sure.
And so one of the other issues you might have to deal with when removing mugwort is if you're getting it late June or late May, early June, if you have an area that has grassland ground nesting birds, you certainly don't want to be, driving a spray truck over the nest. So there are different things we need to weigh.
Definitely. So someone followed up with their mugwort question, also mentioning they're worried about groundsel bush taking over. it's a native plant, so I think depends on where we're talking about for that question. If you want to jump in and ask, please feel free to do so. You know, as a native plant, though, I would presume that we don't need to worry so much about it taking over unless, you know, the desire is to have something else growing in that location.
Right. So so in our case, the groundsel bush really grows at the edge of that area. So it's an area that we want to have that shrubland border anyway. I haven't seen it coming up. So where the grassland was reverting to shrubs, those shrubs are more the bayberry. That's going to be more aggressive than the groundsel bush or the groundsel tree. High bush blueberry, winged sumac, sassafras, those are all things that were great native plants, but they're taking over the grassland habitat. So yeah, I certainly wouldn't worry about groundsel tree taking over when you get rid of the mugwort. And you know, there might be a specific reason that you're concerned about the groundsel tree. But yeah, the plant itself is a really nice native plant and usually restricted to that area close to the water's edge.
So another more broad question, are there examples of other coastal grasslands in Connecticut that should be preserved?
Let's see, that's a good question. I'm going to have to think about that.
All right, well, I can think of like Barn Island as being an important coastal habitat, similar, a little bit similar to this area.
Yeah, so Barn Island, that's a wildlife management area, so it is protected. So there's a couple different habitats there. There's the salt marsh, you know, right on the coastal edge. And that's one of the areas where we might be needing to take drastic measures for the salt marsh sparrow. Inland a little bit in Barn Island, there are some former agricultural fields, and they have been taken over with invasives. So that's a different set of invasives: porcelainberry, black swallowwort, buckthorn, and you get some of the mugwort is there as well. So that's another area where we've been going year after year, trying to target those invasives. So it's really important to really target your invasive plants with the herbicide. You want to leave as much of the native plants as possible so that they can take over when the invasive plants are killed with the herbicide.
Another question, have the salt marshes migrated due to sea level rise?
So one of the problems with the salt marshes migrating is in many places, roads and houses have been built right up to the salt marsh. So in some cases, there's no place for the salt marsh to migrate to. So in our areas, what we're looking at is where can these salt marshes migrate to? So the Niering Natural Area Preserve, I mean, there's the road that goes right at the north end of the cove there. So salt marsh might come underneath there. There's a sort of a shrub wetland north of the road there. But yeah, that's definitely an issue that we're dealing with, is where can these marshes migrate to if there's been so much development right up to the marshes? And sometimes it's just a matter of topography. You know, if the marsh is bordered by a slope that's too steep for the marsh to migrate in time to save things like salt marsh sparrows.
Yeah, definitely a challenge with the rising sea levels. We are doing some studies of that here at the Mammacoke Salt Marsh at Connecticut College, and hopefully we'll have more information about that in the future. Someone sent me a message asking about a list of all of the native goldenrods, and I quickly checked our native and naturalized vascular plants of Connecticut, and it looks like there are in fact 26 native species of goldenrod in Connecticut, which is pretty remarkable. Several of which are at the Niering Natural Area Preserve. But this is a great resource for folks interested in finding out which plants are native to the state of Connecticut.
And if you use the Go Botany website, so Native Plant Trust Go Botany website, if you just type in goldenrod, and it will show you all the different goldenrods. So if you type in Solidago, it will show you all the goldenrods that are in the Solidago genus.
Great, yeah, that's another super resource for native plants.
And if you're looking to purchase native plants, Earth Tones Native Plant Nursery in Woodbury is one of the best around. They sell native plants, but they try to maintain local sources, so local ecotypes. And I also just learned about a source for native plant seeds. So the sources of these seeds have all been collected from Ecoregion 59, which we're in. And it's called Eco 59.
That's great. That's the seed company is actually called Eco 59.
Yeah, it's a seed collective. So Connecticut NOFA has been involved in this.
Oh, sure, right.
Collecting wild seeds from Ecoregion 59 and providing them to various farmers who grow the plants and collect the seeds. So that's the crop that they're growing are native plants. They collect the seeds and sell it to this Eco 59, which sells it to the public. They don't have a big supply yet. And I'm trying to remember which plants they have, like common milkweed, butterfly milkweed, some asters, I think, Joe Pye weed, they have ironweed. So they don't have a big, they don't have a big selection yet, but they intend to expand their selection.
No, I'm definitely familiar with the larger project. I didn't know it was available for the seeds were available for purchase to the general public at this point. Dina Brewster was a SALT speaker for us a couple of years ago and spoke a bit about the project. Nice. We have it looks like 2 more questions in here. One is, but they're both a little bit longer, but let me see if I can work through them here. This is from Anna, and Anna, you're welcome to jump on if you like. But it says, I have an old orchard that was overtaken very quickly with mugwort. Last summer, I noticed that a parasitic plant called dodder was growing on top of it. The mugwort underneath is dying. The dodder has no roots, so it takes energy from the host plant. I'm hoping the dodder will win, and I'm now hoping that will be easier to eradicate when and if it succeeds in getting rid of the mugwort. I guess it wasn't a question; it was more of a statement. But
yeah, let us know what happens.
Yeah, and I mean that's the goal with any of these native plants, right? Or with native plants is to hope that they will overtake the non-native. But I think the dodder will also need to be controlled.
Right, but yeah, if we can say, I used to have my big problem at my house was the ground ivy, and I just keep ripping it out. Well, I don't have much ground ivy anymore because mugwort came in. So now I'm battling the mugwort. But then as I get a handle on the mugwort, then the ground ivy starts coming back.
Another question about the preserve. I heard about managing existing habitats at the preserve by fire, herbicide, etc. Has any consideration been made to deliberately plant native species that are not present or underrepresented at the preserve to enhance its ecological functionality?
We haven't considered at this point planting anything native, just because we want to see what natives come in on their own. So, that Eco 59, part of the reason for doing what they're doing is to keep the local ecotypes. So the best way to get native plants is to let them grow where they want to grow. It doesn't always work out that way, But if you can, like you can even try this in your yard. Take a patch of lawn and stop mowing it. See what comes up, because chances are you're going to get quite a few nice native plants just coming up on their own. And those are the plants that belong right in that area. Of course, you're also going to get invasive plants too that you're going to have to control. But once we see, after a few more years of this type of habitat work, we'll see what comes in on its own. And then if something if something is really lacking that really should be there, then we would certainly consider finding a local ecotype and adding that to the mix.
Another question was asking for if several plants were present. I have a copy of Niering's report from 1995, but it's not a complete inventory of all plants that were present. Jane and I were speaking a little bit before her presentation today, just about that list. And Jane, maybe you could tell folks what you do have available in terms of a plant inventory or species list for the site, and maybe we can see how we can get that information to folks.
So there's currently not an official complete list of everything that's there. It certainly would be nice to compile a thorough list of all plant species that are there. We have the list of what was there when Dr. Niering did his work in '95. I've added a few species, just more casual observations without doing any official survey work. We also keep track of some of the butterfly sightings that have been there, and keeping track on eBird, some of the bird sightings that are there as well. So citizen science is a great thing. So if you see some things, feel free to post it in some of these citizen science websites, because we do look at those.
Great. Well, maybe I'll share with everyone then Niering's report from 1995, which is by no means complete. One of the plants listed in here is Hibiscus moschutos, the swamp rose mallow, and I don't think that is mentioned in Niering's report, but it definitely has been present, and what was present this summer, actually quite prolific this summer. Is kind of beautiful to see a whole area with the pink flowers in late summer. So we'll see if we can get that out to all of you. Let's see. I think that wraps up all of our questions. If anyone else has anything they want to share, please feel free to jump on and ask a question. We had a lot of great questions, a lot of great information. We will send out a link to the presentation to the participants. So if you weren't able to catch all of the names of all of the plants or insects, you could watch it again and get that information. Let's see. So, someone's asking about inviting someone else to come do a survey at the property. I think whether it's Connecticut College students going back 25 years later, or getting Botanical Society or some other organization, we probably could find a few volunteers and citizen scientists to maybe spend a week down there at that beautiful location and start to document and inventory the plants that are there, because I'm sure over the past 25 years that has changed.
Oh, I'm sure it has,
changed with time. Great. Well, Jane, thank you so much for your presentation today. I hope everyone has a chance to go down and enjoy this really beautiful site along Long Island Sound and explore the plants that are there, and be inspired by all of this for your own home gardens and landscapes that you manage. I also just want to remind everyone to join us next Wednesday, November 17th, for Beyond Pollinator Friendly, Designing Landscapes and Corridors to Support Regional Biodiversity, with Evan Abramson, the Principal of Landscape Interactions. If anything else comes up, feel free to email us at the Arboretum or give us a call so we can talk more about native plants and share the many resources that we have available here from the Arboretum. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.
Maggie, just one last comment.
yeah, sure.
For people who want to visit the Niering Natural Area Preserve, the access is actually going right into the main parking lot for Harkness Memorial State Park. And then if you, from the parking lot, if you head west, right directly from the parking lot down into that little area, there's also a blind down there, but there's a little path where you can walk down there, and that's what people can access.
Yeah, and at the start of your presentation, you showed the large kind of memorial dedication stone to Bill Niering, and that's at kind of the headway to the main path that goes into the preserve. But yeah, it's interesting because the preserve is kind of split by Goshen Cove. So you know, to get over onto the Enders property, I'm not sure if that access is as easy or public, but definitely from the Harkness State Park side, it's easy to get in and encouraged to visit from that side.
Yeah, the other side is not public access.
Right. Okay. But yeah, great plants, great diversity of plants though, and you can look across the cove and see the grasslands over there pretty well from the cove, or from the I guess the east side of the cove.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for being here, and thank you, Jane, so much for everything you've shared with us today. Really, really exciting information.
Well, thank you.